All right, we look to be all pretty good. Somil, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Kickoff Sessions. I really appreciate you taking the time as well to come on board and have a chat around careers. So obviously our touch point was Cullum, my roommate for quite a long time now at this stage. So I want to get your perspective on different types of careers, skills we need, tech to kind of get you involved with, as well as just other areas around business for young people kicking off their career.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Jared. And yes, Colin and I, our touch points have been really exciting in terms of finance, consulting, etc. So that's a great connect already.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's the exact same my background as well. So I started off in consulting with Accenture, and then always had kind of an interest in finance, and now I've been moved more into the finance kind of area, and that's kind of the part of my own like evolutionary career aspect, I suppose. Was like started off on something good starting point, moving into different areas. So that's a learning, that I've really picked up myself. So I think you're quite similar, or anyone is really.
That's right. Anyone. I mean, the number of people, for example, in my generation, probably a little bit less in yours, who have sort of worked in finance and consulting and back and forth. I mean, that's a very, very high proportion, especially in a place like London. So yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, I started after university working for Deutsche Bank, and I worked for Deutsche Bank in many locations. I've worked in consulting, and I've also worked in sort of financial technology. These days we call it fintech. Back then it
Mhm.
was called .com or something like that. But yes, I mean this sort of movement between banking and consulting, they were often considered to be the desired industries. But I would also say that the things are a little bit different now. I think technology and a lot of innovative business models, those are probably more exciting career opportunities than
Mhm.
corporate banking and consulting.
Yeah, especially I think as well because like the consulting model, you could be working in any field. So even though you could be working for a consulting firm, you could be in any different industry or working on any different type of job. So when people go into kind of the fintech space or a specialized version, they get a lot of focus and experience in a certain area that they may enjoy more than a kind of a wider span or just general banking as well. What was your kind of initial approach towards that? Especially you're saying how transferable it was. Was it what was your initial attraction? Do you think it was because you had a lot of
Yeah.
skill in it, a lot of background in it?
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, when I first started working in consulting, I was clear that finance is the only industry that I'm interested in. And I want to work in finance consulting. But looking back, some of the consulting projects that I did in the government sector, some of the consulting projects that I did in energy utilities,
Mhm.
in nonprofit sectors, I mean, they were the ones where I actually learned more, you know. And if I could tell something to my 25 or 30-year self, I'd say, just be a little bit more open-minded to other
Mhm.
industries. The development of the skills, especially the soft skills, was a lot more in areas where I was not really the subject matter person, because then you kind of need to have a bit more of an open mind. And the core consulting skills, the listening, analysis, presentation, they get developed a lot more in those sort of projects.
And like for people that don't come from a consulting background, what do you think were like the kind of core competencies there that really kind of helped you or you should start off your career in? Because I'm quite similar to self. Like I would be kind of more soft skill focused than technical skills, more so like I wouldn't be that technical of a guy. But I knew that kind of consulting did help me in that field in terms of just being able to manage expectations, stakeholder management, getting involved with different people. But from your own perspective, like where do you think you should really be focusing your energy on from the very beginning?
Yeah, I mean, in consulting, as I sort of touched upon, listening skills are very, very important. Active
Mhm.
listening, not just hearing, but listening, trying to understand the other person's point of view. That sort of thing is hugely important. Analysis, of course, from sort of financial analysis to industry sectoral analysis to any form of analysis. I mean, organizational analysis skills are very, very important. And of course, presentation, communication, that's a lot more important in consulting and perhaps in
Mhm.
banking or finance. But the number one thing that I would say that sort of consulting taught me was commercial thinking, you know. And of course, you'd sort of say, oh, well, finance is pretty commercial. And it is. It is. There's no doubt about that. But but the pressure that you have as a consultant, every minute, every hour, every day, you kind of have to justify why you're there in another person's company, you know,
Mhm.
and therefore, how are you adding value? Why are you adding value? When did you last do something meaningful for the client? When do you
Mhm.
next plan to do something meaningful for the client? That sort of thinking kind of becomes second nature. And that's really, really important in a variety of sectors, not just consulting.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the whole factor of like stakeholder management and just having deadlines and managing deadlines. So if you're in an industry role and you're trying to get into those different kind of competitive roles, I think that's like very important as well. But it's hard to just know that from the outset. So if you're going to apply for a company and you're trying to, I don't know, get into somewhere that's competitive, it could be an industry job, a finance job, and seeing what they actually need on the inside without having that experience can be quite difficult at first, you know? So like how would you like approach those different areas? So if you were to go towards like an interview and you're trying to hit this different criteria of I need to have those soft skills, those technical skills, but how do I get them across in such a way that it's actually easily understandable towards the actual interviewee?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right. And there is nothing like research and networking to make that happen. In preparation for this session, I listened to some of the previous recordings that you had with other people that you had talked to, and all of them talked about networking and the importance of network. And that's something that I would totally put my name behind as well. Sort of knowing who's the other person, what sort of background does he or she have, what's what are their hot buttons, what are the things that they may be concerned about, and a lot of it is visible from their sort of web footprint, right? Looking at their LinkedIn profile, when I've sort of been on the other side, I've been the interviewer. It's surprising how many times I would have people who'd be very comfortable talking about their skills, their experience, their background, but have done very, very little research around what I'm interested in, what my company is interested in, and why is that a good fit, and that sort of thing. And that makes all the difference, really.
Mm. How do you think that actually should be done? So let's say if you're trying to do your kind of due diligence on the company, like when I was interviewing recently, last couple of months, I remember the only thing that really helped me was the fact that I knew so much about the product. Because the company that I'm in now with Revolut, I would have been a long-term customer of the product. I would have known it
Yeah,
quite well. I would have used it. So when I got into an interview and they're asking me about the product or why do I want to work there, it seemed pretty an obvious choice. Then when I got
yeah,
to the whoever was interviewing me, I did my due diligence, but I was trying to figure out what they needed, which kind of came from the job spec, what they wanted. But I think when it's like a little bit a little bit more complicated. So if it's a company that you may not be aware of, but you want to work in this industry, how should you kind of approach the different kind of research element of it?
yeah. I mean, it's entirely possible that networking or research did not really give you very strong insights about a company or a product or an
Mm,
individual. In that case, what I would say is ask a question, right in the beginning of the interview,
mm.
before jumping into, well, I'm Somil and I started in Deutsche Bank and so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
yeah, yeah,
You might as well ask a question. Hey, what's meaningful to you?
yeah.
How's your year going? A lot of these things about being able to ask sort of open-ended questions and listening actively, um, you know, and then sort of formulate in your mind what's going to be your pitch. I mean, that's the other way to kind of look at it.
Yeah, it was actually interesting because one thing I would recommend as well is that when I was interviewing with the hiring manager, we just started chatting, like you said, just asking questions. She actually came from a consulting background, and as a result, we were able to chat about that. She actually came from EY as well at the time, and then we already had like a kind of a relationship built, just like just something small, a kind of like a medium playing field, and then it was quite easy from there to just go to kind of level up the questions and be able to get more insights, more feedback. But that's what I often find as well is that like, an interview isn't necessarily about them asking you questions. It's just as much about you asking them questions to see do they fit you as well as the other way around, because you're going to go through like 5 rounds often and being able to get under the covers really and trying to figure out exactly what you want from this role is more important as well than them trying to find out are you a good fit.
No, absolutely true. I mean, typically it's a cliche that the interviewer will ask you, "Do you have any questions for me?"
Yeah.
And the most important part of any interview preparation that I would recommend is having two really good questions to ask that interviewer. And these should not be things that you can get from the
Google.
website, or these should not really. I mean, they should really be meaningful questions,
Mhm.
and the question should be such that they allow you to drive the conversation back towards your skills and your strengths and your desires.
Correct. Yeah, it
Um,
should be
and
fluid.
that, yeah, and that's hard to do, but very, very important to do. I mean, I would definitely recommend spending 20, 30% of the preparation time on what questions are you going to ask.
Yeah. And I think as well as just making it kind of fluid, like so building it into not just the last 2 minutes and trying to get it into the last 2 minutes, you know. I think that's a common misconception people have is like, oh yeah, I'm gonna wait till be asked. Can I like ask questions? Whereas it should be always kind of fluid and coming through
Yeah.
naturally, you know.
Yeah.
Um when you like have you been interviewing people in the past and you're looking for people that are like good candidates or things like this, what do you see that kind of it stands out explicitly? So like the standard would be, you know, everyone has a 1-1 these days. Everyone is like, you know, high caliber student. So let's say if it's Deutsche Bank and the people that are going through the interview process, they're already going to be highly intelligent, high IQ, good grades, and a good background. Do you think there's other things to distinguish yourself that you should be focusing on? So maybe it
Mm.
could be extracurricular stuff, it could be more university engagement, could be side projects. Like what would you kind of recommend, or do you think this is even a valuable activity to run off and do, or should you just focus on your main core competencies?
I mean, you could focus on your core competencies. You could have a much wider, less deep kind of a profile. Different people will feel comfortable in different sort of a scenario. But the most important thing, really, and you're right. I mean, there is an element of competence and all that, and of course, an experienced person will be able to judge competence, in a deeper way than what comes across from the CV. But also it's about how well do the values and the purpose align. You know, so if I'm working in a particular area, I mean, you mentioned revenue, right? So if I'm working in fintech and mobile banking and a particular customer segment, fast growth, those are the things that are important for me, and I'm an interviewer for revenue. The most important thing for me to judge is, does this jive with the way the interviewee kind of thinks about it? Do they
Mm,
also see that new business is the key economic driver? Do they also see that the key skill is problem solving and not administering an estate that already exists and has existed for 40 years or whatever, right? So that, I mean, that sort of alignment of values, alignment of purpose, that becomes a very, very important thing. And sometimes it can go down to brass tacks. I mean, I remember this is a few years ago um, for a fintech, and I was interviewing technical staff, and all of them came from banking backgrounds. They worked for large international banks, software developers. And one of the questions I used to always ask was, why do you want to leave? And they would, of course, often say that, well, they have all these restrictions because of ways of working and so on and so forth, and therefore they want to work for a more exciting and new company. And then I used to often ask, well, what are you willing to sacrifice to do that?
mm,
Right? So you're getting good amount of money, good career progression in working for a bank, um, but it is not satisfying you at a technical level or at creative level. What are you willing to sacrifice in order to get that technical satisfaction, that creative satisfaction? And if there is anything, and that used to stump a lot of people, right? So I used to often sort of throw it in there. What if I offered you a job which gives you all the creative and technical satisfaction, but gives you half the amount of money? Would you do that, right? And to me, that was a very telling question, because the kind of reaction that I got kind of told me how well will our business's values align with the individual when the chips are down. You know what I mean?
mm.
We were not offering jobs at half the salary, but how a person sort of thinks about that problem, analyzes it, and sort of kind of responds to it. That was a good question, I felt, really. And actually, every person who gave an unsatisfactory answer to that question, and still we hired that person, ended up being a bad hire. So looking back, that was my killer question.
That's so interesting, especially if you think about like when people leave companies, banks to start their own project, where they could be on much less of like of a salary, so they could be like 50% salary hit or 70% or 80%, but they're
Yeah,
working on a passion project, and it's like, are they willing to make that sacrifice to work on
exactly.
something that is personal to themselves and that is something that they really really enjoy?
Yeah, and to be clear, I was not looking for people who would work for half the salary. What I was looking for
Exactly.
was somebody who can actually think in those terms.
Yeah.
And say that, well, here's a minimum that I must have because of life situation and all that. But these are the ways in which I'm willing to compromise, or these are the ways in which I'm willing to bring something extra to the table to show that alignment of purpose and values.
Yeah, and that's why I love like thinking like really deeply about like different things like alignment, even with companies, because even from like a revenue perspective, like their kind of mottos are like think deeper, which is like strong analysis,
Mm.
like get it done, which is like hard work, persistence, and things like this. So they've often like looked for those types of candidates, and people that are in the companies are all like A players, are all really good. But it's interesting because like if you showed up with a slightly different approach, it's just a misalignment. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not qualified. It just means that it's not a good fit, and
Yeah.
that's where often I found if I went to interview for a different company back in the day, and if I didn't really necessarily align with the company myself, well, then I knew it wasn't a proper fit. And you may not even explicitly outline it, but you know yourself intrinsically, subconsciously, that sometimes the shoe just doesn't fit, and it's not a good match.
No, no, absolutely. And I've worked for a number of consulting companies and banks, both as an employee as well as a consultant. But looking back, I can absolutely think that there were one or two companies where the values alignment was the best. And those are the times that I enjoyed the best, I performed the best. I mean, you mentioned EY is where your hiring manager worked. That's where Colin worked or works still.
Yep.
I'm not sure. And although when I met him, he was not at EY. And, I was in EY. I was an associate partner in their sort of financial services digital practice for a couple of years. And yeah, I mean, I sort of look back to that time very fondly because of that values alignment. It's not about what I was doing, that maybe not that different to Accenture or some other company, but because of the values.
Yeah, it's quite interesting just to see the kind of dynamic change, and as well knowing when to move on, when to try something else if it doesn't kind of fizzle out and things like this, especially from
Okay.
just a career progression perspective, because when you get into a job, it's not a job for life anymore. People have, it's widely accepted. So I think
Yeah.
maybe like getting enough experience and taking that experience and moving on. Like, do you think there's an element there of you should be kind of getting as much out of a job as possible, and then possibly looking for something that's more aligned to you or your next step of where you want to go next in your career?
Yeah. I mean, whether you're changing jobs or working in the same company, I mean, it's clear that new business is the key
Mm,
driver, right?
hmm.
So, you know, I mean, just look around yourself, right? Whatever we are using half the time in our lives, all this stuff really came about in the last 10, 20 years, right? Or 30
Yeah,
years, something like that.
exactly. Yeah.
And it's not that it was a unique thing that happened in the late 90s or early noughties. I mean, this is a fact of life, in
Yeah.
2030, the kind of stuff we'd be using, a lot of it is being invented right now, right? So,
Yeah.
so whether you're working for one company and kind of doing different things with them, or you're sort of changing companies, um, new business, a new role, every 18 to 24 months, that is definitely something that I would recommend to any of your listeners, really. That mindset should always be there, because
Mm.
that's just the way of life.
Yeah, it's just a rolling with the times. Like that's so interesting. Even when you specify like about a new business, so like things updating, things changing, how do you think people should like roll with that? So like keeping up to date with different, I don't know, not necessarily
Yeah.
trends, but like the way things are changing. So a perfect instance is coronavirus restrictions, people moving a whole home, adjusting and developing. So even for myself, like as in when I adjusted to moving a home and working from home, I needed to get back into a rhythm of presenting online, doing presentations for clients at the time, making sure that everything ran really well. And I felt like quite adjusted relatively well. But how do you feel on maybe a bigger scale than that for people to keep up to date with things and really be able to navigate their career and progress at a accelerated pace, because that's kind of where people want to progress.
That's right. And big and small, every adjustment, every change requires thinking. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll go back to what you just said, right? Did you say think deeper or dig deeper, something like that as the motto?
Think it's actually a really good they're really good values. So it's think deeper is one, then it's get it done,
Mm.
and I should really remember the other ones. They'll come to me in a minute.
Think deeper was the one that I would sort of focus on, right? I mean,
Mhm.
there are two or three things, right? Flexibility, technology, these are key enablers, right, for doing new things. Technology, because there we are, right? I mean, something like 10 years ago, I think Mark Andreessen wrote this seminal blog post, which was in Wall Street Journal, and so much that's happened in the last 10 years in the world, really, in the business world. was sort of foreseen by his blog post. And his blog post was titled, Software is Eating the World. And I almost think it's absolutely true, but I almost think that the world is also eating software. The world loves software. We love using software to do things that previously we did without using software. Either we did person to person or we did on, using hardware or whatever. We love using Zoom rather than telephones because it just gives us so much more flexibility. And Zoom is basically a software on top of telephone lines, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the world is software. The world is sort of really excited about how can it use software for doing things. So yeah, I mean, number one practical advice I can give in terms of keeping up with the changes is knowing the sort of the most important tech tools that are emerging in your area, being engaged with them, not just as a user, but even as somebody who can build tools, contribute to the process of building tools. If you're not a developer, then perhaps in the area of product management, testing, whatever. But really sort of being engaged with the software tool development process, because it is not just the fact that software is eating the world, but it is also that our world loves eating software.
Mhm.
So that's something that I would say that, I mean, having the flexibility, mental flexibility, and then engagement is very important. That comes from partly, at least, from the values and purposes alignment, but be very focused on technology because that is the enabler of pretty much everything we do right now. Not just
Yeah.
our business lives and interactions, but even things like medicine and how I interact with my parents now is software driven. Yeah, I mean that's just the reality of things.
Mhm. Yeah, especially if you think about like the fact that, you know, we usually would be kind of hands off and people wouldn't be early adopters. And it's only until it's after gone through essentially like the life cycle that people get to and adopt to it. So I think it's only if like you're able to catch it at an earlier stage, get up to grips with it, not as a developer, but really just be able to just I think keep pace with something and then identify kind of different trends from it because it may not be you want to work in a company. You might be able to roll it out as your own product. You could, I don't know, do a different spin on things. But I think there's a lot of more opportunities by becoming a bit more centered to it versus
Yeah,
more in denial.
no, absolutely. As a user, as something that you can assimilate, something that you
Mhm.
could synthesize on top of, all of those possibilities are there. And also, I mean, I may not wish to be an early adopter in every single thing. That's impossible.
Mhm.
But I need to realize that the whole sort of adoption cycles are becoming more and more compressed, right? So a few years ago, a new product will take software or not, will take many months, many years even, when the early adopters would use it. And then it'll be a few years later that it becomes a mass market product.
Mhm.
And then it'll last for a decade or two, and then it'll sort of die out and something new will come in its place. And that whole cycle that used to run decades, or definitely years, that whole cycle is becoming shorter and shorter. And my perfect example for this is BlackBerry, right? When I remember 2004 or something, when I first had a BlackBerry, because Deutsche Bank that I worked for gave me a BlackBerry, right?
Mhm.
In 2004, getting a BlackBerry was, yeah, by 2007, pretty much everyone had a BlackBerry. And I think, what is it, by 2010, almost nobody had a BlackBerry, right? So
Yeah.
it's sort of,
Only until recently where everyone started buying their stock again.
yeah, yeah. So, on a 6 or 7 year scale, it kind of went from being or maybe an 8 year scale, it went from being an early adopter product to kind of being dead, really.
Mm.
And this was also more than 10 years ago, right? And the cycles now are even faster. And we see that over and over again. We see that with Pokemon Go. We will see that once there is a really useful AR, VR type of a product, that the adoption would be really, really quick. And therefore, evaluating what can I do with it? Do I like it? Does it align with my purposes and values? Can I use it for business purposes? Engaging with new stuff is very, very important in today's business world.
Mm, that's yeah, I completely agree. Especially if you think about like in terms of banking. So like when fintechs came around, traditional banks were saying, "Don't worry about it. We don't need to worry about them. They're all going to be crushed to the side." And then a couple of years later, they became a big force, and now like they have a real power horse going through at the moment. Now again, the future of them could be quite questionable. Like we don't know like the longevity approach, but it's like they did come on the scene really, really fast over the last 3 to 5 years. Really,
Yeah,
disruptive in that kind of space.
absolutely true. One thing which I would say, and I'll sort of stick up a little bit for the banks here, that actually banking as an industry and a lot of banks as organizations, they have been really good at new business. So I worked for Deutsche Bank for a number of years, and over that period of time, it is not that I was doing same or similar things. Pretty much every couple of years, I would be driving, setting up a new product, a new business line, you know,
Mm.
and an average period of time for which a business line would last. I mean, there may be an FX trading, and you could say FX trading is a business line, and it sort of is. But within FX trading, the different business lines, the different desks, the different strategies, their half-life would be measured in months rather than years, right?
Mm.
So how long does the strategy, how long does the customer segment remain important, remain active, remain profitable? It will be, 10, 15, 20 months, it would not be 5, 6 years. So that sort of flexibility around, what's the next important thing for the customer? How can we make money and therefore a good return for the shareholder? What's important for the society as a whole? And that sort of thinking definitely has been very important in banks. The part where the banks kind of do fall behind fintech quite a bit is the technology, because so many new things happen one on top of the other. The old stuff is almost never retired, and therefore it just becomes too unwieldy to do something new and something different at
Mm.
scale. And that's where Revolut and others can definitely provide a much better user experience.
Mm. And like, yeah, because like to clarify that point, like the large institution banks, like kind of the investment banks, like they have been kind of rolling with the times really well, obviously, and a lot of them have been actually performing really well. Like Goldman, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley are obviously performing really well. I mean more like traditional retail banking, just with a retail arm, long credit line book, which essentially has been really under a lot of pressure because of COVID and whatnot. Those kind of banks have been kind of like falling down, and the fintechs have replaced them with, again, like faster technology, better access to customer support, customer products. And I think it's just more of a generational thing. Like myself, my generation want more of a streamlined social app that we can send our cash to our friends at a restaurant, and things like this is much more mobile. And I think that's where it really gets fit that model of a younger generation. Now, again, it could be the next generation may need a different product, and it could be something else, but I think that's where like the cyclical nature of this like kind of product technology like cycle has kind of come true really.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. Yeah, there's a product, there's something different. They get merged in the next cycle, something new comes up, and that sort of
Mhm.
cycle repeats it.
But
Yeah,
that's the thing with tech companies in general, though. As in, like they're so nimble, like they're very aggressive for the rollout. Like all tech companies are like 2 week sprints. They're rolling out new features. They're not huge features, but they're just small features or enhancements in 2 weeks periods. Whereas
yeah,
like some older style companies, like they would have to go through a product approval process that would often spend weeks and months. Like funnily enough, I interviewed Colin Breyer. He was one of the originals from Amazon, and even Amazon went through like this incredibly hefty, long product approval process. It was still nimble, like in comparison to other big companies. But he was saying that even though they have so many of these products out in market, and some of them are successful, some of them aren't, that it was just like not in any stretch of imagination a short period of approval to being rolled out.
yeah. No, that definitely becomes it's a feature of the technical complexity and the organizational complexity and so on.
Mhm.
And 2 weeks, I mean, I would almost say that 2 weeks is not exactly state of the art or world leading. Should be able to do that in half a day or something. Really, I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's
in
crazy.
one more thing that I would say, and this is probably a role for traditional sort of institutions, um, to the extent that they cannot really change their history or their legacy that easily is understood. But a key role that they can play is to finance and bring new business ideas to the market. So if I'm a traditional institution which has got good regional connections or whatever, And I do want to add value to my customers and offer a more mobile, a more social experience. What I could do is that I could work with your company, for example, and finance some sort of an option plan or something to ultimately offer some kind of value to my users and still be relevant. And that's the sort of that's the sort of, let's say, open-minded thinking that probably
Mhm.
is going to be useful.
And how would that work? Like, how does that actually process work?
Yeah, we could many different ways. I mean, it could be a joint venture, it could be some kind of white labeling kind of a deal. It could just be a financing deal, right? I mean, for financing new businesses, for instance, the options today are better than ever, right? So therefore, people are not really looking for money for new business ideas, but smart money, right? So money plus other things. So if somebody, if I'm developing X, which an established company thinks is going to add value to their customer base or their market or their products, and this company was to say, okay, I'm going to give you some money, but in return, we have to do this integration or whatever, or this
Mhm.
joint venture. I mean, that may be a better deal for me as an entrepreneur because I'm getting money plus that extra that extra factor. Because today, I mean, if you look at financing options, right, I mean, whether it's fintechs helping fintechs, institutional funding, VCs, private equity, whatever, private wealth, family offices, and that sort of thing, high net worth individual business angels, the government sector, right? I mean, I work for a company right now called GovGrant who helps UK startups and SMEs get better value, better commercial value for their research and intellectual property, right? I mean, how many of them don't think of patents because they think it's too expensive, the returns aren't really that great. But it's actually the reverse, really. It can be done quick, it can be done cheaply, and the returns
Mhm.
can be absolutely fantastic, partly because of government sort of support. So for financing new businesses, the options are better than ever. And that's why I say established company with established product line can actually offer money plus something new, something different for both their customers as well as the fintech challenges, really.
Mhm. That's interesting. That's interesting. And you think that's still like applicable to kind of early stage founders as well? Like if they're looking to come in and try to do this sort of financing model, is that
Yeah,
quite familiar, do you think?
I think so. I mean, a lot of companies, for example, over the last 5 years, especially, have run a number of accelerator programs and incubation programs and
Of
all that.
course,
And a lot
yeah.
of that is very much about getting an early stage entrepreneur into their business,
Hmm.
exposing that person with some of the business sort of characteristics, clients, and volume and flow, and so on and so forth, data, and then hoping that something new comes out of that sort of synergy between sort of old school data and clients and money and access and new school thinking, right? I mean, so a lot of companies have done that. I mean, and that was actually the context in which I met Colin, because at EY there was a company which took part in our startup challenge, and I sort of was then working with that company. And Colin was at that time working for the Fed in Boston, and we had a workshop between this fintech, it's called Adjoint, and the Boston Fed around how can new technology be applied to central bank digital currencies and cash clearing and things like that. But that was the first time that I met Colin. So yeah, I mean, it can definitely work by having that sort of open thinking.
Yeah, it's definitely like the best time to be looking for financing and whatnot. Like over the last couple of years with all these different options, all the boot like not even like from bootstrapping to getting financing for through incubators. So like, in Ireland, even there's some great ones in Dublin, some great ones in Cork, and I think they offer a lot of the support, even non-financially, that people
Yeah,
really do need. And I see a lot of successful startups coming out of Ireland who would have just had those mentorships. It could be someone like yourself who's in there just offering some support and strategy and guidance. Because when you're 21, 22, trying to embark on something like this, it's very difficult at first.
yeah, but if you have the commitment, I mean, from Ireland, Stripe is probably the biggest story in the world, right?
Yeah.
And when you're not even 21, 22, 21, 22 is very experienced. When you are 17 or
Mhm.
19, you could actually, embark on something big. And that's exactly right, because I mean, the new world is very open to new ideas. It's in many ways, it's like playing football in the park, right? Anyone can join the game as long as you
Mm,
play the game, right? And
mhm.
So in that sense, it is very, very open, and financing, I totally agree. Like I said, from the government schemes to family offices, institutions, this really is a golden age in many ways for startup financing.
Nice. You mentioned there in digital currencies as well and just digital assets in general. Obviously there was a lot of boom around that kind of 2017, 2018. A lot of, there was a lot of talk of institutions adopting their own types of stable coins. I even worked with State Street at the time, who had published a lot of papers on stable coins. Do you think there's a rich kind of history or rich future in this, should I say, over the next couple of years? Do you think there's a lot of scope for it, or like what's your kind of perspective on that now? Just your own opinion.
Yeah, I mean, 2017 was a bull run. And obviously last year, beginning of this year, was another one. And there have been more before that. Um, I mean, there are two or three things which sort of come in there, right? One is distributed way of working. And that is, of course, very, very powerful. We see that not just in cryptocurrencies or digital assets, but also, for example, in all sorts of open source projects, right? Linux, as an example.
Yeah.
It's a distributed way of working. I mean, it's clear that it's going to be even more important in the next 10, 20 years than it has been in the last 20 years. Then there's an element of sort of private cryptocurrencies as stores of value. That's a thesis that's hard to kind of understand at the moment. That said, I mean, I did listen to some of the people on your podcast previously who were quite sort of bearish about it. You got to keep an open mind, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Netscape did its IPO, and everyone was like, "What, a loss-making company is doing an IPO?" It was unthinkable. But loss-making companies having a lot of market value is not an unthinkable concept. And this is in my living memory, right? So this happened in whatever, 96 or whatever. So it's not that it happened in 1842 or some such thing, really. So the market perceptions can change, and they do change. But it is more difficult to understand what would be the long-term future of cryptocurrencies per se. But distributed ways of working, of course, is very, very important. So yeah, I mean, how to create good use cases, have user value by distributed ways of working with or without cryptocurrencies. I think that's really important.
Yeah, because I'm kind of more even looking at it from like an innovation perspective and improving on the current technology, whether it's a distributed ledger or not. So if it's not the current like form of digital assets, but it could be, I don't know, a fork of Ethereum, it could be something like this. But down the road, this kind of goes back to our original point of when something comes up, it's good to be aware of it and cognizant and maybe learning these different things, because it may be something that you may have you may should not necessarily buy into. I'm not saying you should buy into it, but I'm saying that the technology, you may want to apply it or get involved with it, and therefore being kind of aware of it is important. So that's why I'd like to get your kind of thoughts on where you kind of see like what sort of like rollout of these different systems, even like you're saying there about the different kind of ledger approach, but like, is this going to be more of an important factor, do you think, down the road versus the way we currently have things set up?
Yeah, and the core innovation of a multi-sig wallet, going back to Nakamoto's sort of white paper, how to apply that in multiple use cases. There will be a lot more creativity around that. There already has been, and I think we need to keep trying before we find lots and lots of ways in which this will be very meaningful. And still early days. It's still early days. I mean, crypto has been around for whatever 12, 13 years now, but really applying it to sort of business use cases has been around for less than 10 years. So yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, there would have been some good outcomes already. 10 years is a long enough time. But yeah, some of them may not be very far away either.
Especially I think because like some of the companies may not have had like the correct like infrastructure to begin with, the teams and whatnot. It's not like a big institution is essentially running with these projects. So possibly that's where the scope comes in the future of using this type of technology to actually make use cases that are feasible for like larger audiences possibly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's been a lot of diversion, let's say, because of the whole cryptocurrency value boom, right? So that kind of creates strange incentives, and therefore the focus is more on mining and sort of
Exactly,
buying
exactly, exactly,
one
exactly.
rather than the innovation. But yeah, I mean, look, all of this we saw during dot-com days, right? Where X.com, Y.com, Z.com, whatever, anything.com has suddenly become very valuable. And a lot of money is going into simply creating the content and so on, not really developing a use case or not really adding consumer value. But then, there was a bus, and things came out of that, and it has really, really changed the world. And something like this is very likely to happen with distributed ways of working with or without crypto.
Yeah, and that's super super interesting because even when you said like the name of like a cryptocurrency, everyone thinks initially about the value of it, and then people are ready to say that it's not at the right value, or people say that it's going to go higher, but that's not really what we're kind of discussing here. It's more so like, will this be something that should be implemented long term? And if it is, then all the pricing stuff is just over there. It's as if the price like never existed, let's say, but we're just focusing on the actual use case, what's in it, which is the way things should really be. If you take away all the price, that's the way it should be.
That's right. And a friend of mine sort of gave this analogy to rain, right? We can sit and forecast, is it going to rain tomorrow? And is it going to rain the day after tomorrow? And we can spend a lot of time arguing about that. And we don't really know. But the important thing is, well, when it rains, how am I going to harvest the water? How am I going to use it? How am I going to protect myself if there's a danger of flood? All of those things really add value. So it's the same thing with Bitcoin, crypto, right? Is it going to be more valuable tomorrow, less valuable tomorrow? It's kind of like rain tomorrow. Maybe the real thing is, as you're saying, how do we derive value out of what we have?
Mm. And that's exactly it. Like perfect. That's perfect example or analogy, because like especially with Bitcoin, with like being so single use, like just
Mm.
because the price has gone up doesn't mean that it changes in function. It's going to be the same function and features and everything going on. And it's not like, again, like an Ethereum blockchain whereby people will build applications on it and have that innovation aspect and have that
Yeah.
creativity. Because I think when you come from a tech background, even like yourself, it's like you're kind of interested in those things to see how it pans out. It could be like ARV kind of vibe. It's like I would like to see something successful come out of this and be used for, as you say, go back to the cores of value driven, greater good. Like if it improves like society in some way, well, then that's what's going to kind of stick, I think, and that's my
Yeah.
kind of approach towards it.
And that's a great sort of base to kind of start building a purpose and values driven alignment, right? Bringing it back to the interview question.
Hmm.
Sort of expressing that becomes very, very important in
Yeah.
an interview setting, as an example.
Perfect. Somil, I say a massive thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Really appreciate all your insights, and I thought it was just super helpful because you have a lot of experience in finance and banking, and then it's like pushing all the old kind of style banking into like the future, and looking at that kind of future idea to get yourself set up, whether it's yourself as an employee or someone who wants to be a founder, or someone that just wants to keep up with the pace with like technology and where things are going in the future.
No, it's been great to talk. And yeah, just to recap, I mean, banking consulting have been desired industries, but I think new business is really the driver, even within banking consulting and in general in our economy. And technology as an enabler is the key to everything today. Financing new businesses, that's a great opportunity, and indeed facilitating new businesses. So great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.